Imagine a world where the sun rises over absolute silence. 1 out of every 3 people you love is gone, not in years, but in a matter of days. In the fall of 1347, a dark shadow began to crawl across the globe, turning the cradle of civilization into a massive, nameless grave. It wasn't an invading army or a global war, but a microscopic predator that changed the course of human history forever. This is the story of the Black Death, and how humanity looked into the abyss and survived. Before the plague reached the gates of Europe, it was a silent killer in the steppes of Central Asia. Around 1343, rumors began to swirl of a great mortality in the east. It followed the Silk Road, the world's most vital economic artery. Traders moving from China and India were unknowingly carrying the seeds of the apocalypse in their saddlebags. The bacteria, Yersinia pestis, was hitching a ride on fleas, which lived on the black rats that nested in the merchant caravans. The plague first showed its terrifying face to the west during the siege of Kaffa in 1346. The Mongol army, led by Janibeg, was dying of the disease while trying to take the city. In a desperate and gruesome move, they catapulted the infected corpses of their own soldiers over the city walls. This is one of the first recorded instances of biological warfare in history. The Italian merchants inside the city fled in terror, but the invisible enemy was already hidden on their ships. The official European nightmare began in October 1347. 12 Genoese trading galleys emerged from the Mediterranean fog, docking at the port of Messina, Sicily. The sailors on the pier expected treasures, silks, gold, and spices. Instead, they found a floating morgue. Most of the crew lay dead on the blood-stained decks. The few survivors were gasping for air, their skin covered in oozing black boils. The gates of the underworld had swung open, and there was no way to close them. To understand the terror, we must understand the beast. The bubonic plague was a master of internal destruction. Once bitten by an infected flea, the bacteria traveled to the nearest lymph node. Within hours, the victim was seized by a violent fever and agonizing muscle pain. Then came the buboes, massive, rock-hard swellings in the groin, neck, and armpits. They turned from a deep red to a necrotic, bruised black. The smell was unbearable as the living body began to rot from within. But the plague had a second, even more terrifying form, the pneumonic variant. In the cold winters, the bacteria moved from the blood to the lungs. Now it didn't need fleas or rats to spread. It moved through the air. A single cough, a shared breath, or a whispered prayer was enough to infect an entire room. This version was almost 100% fatal. You could be perfectly healthy at breakfast and be a corpse by dinner. The speed of death was breaking the human spirit. When the citizens of Messina realized the horror within the Genoese ships, they turned to violence. They forced the death ships back out to sea with flaming arrows. But it was far too late. The rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes. The invisible killer was now walking the streets. Panic ignited like dry straw. Families abandoned their homes and fled into the Sicilian countryside, unknowingly acting as messengers for the great mortality, spreading it to every village. By early 1348, the plague had reached the mainland. Italy, the heart of the medieval world, was the first to crumble. In Florence, the great poet Boccaccio described a city where the living were too few to bury the dead. He wrote of people dropping dead in the streets and how the ties of blood and friendship were severed. Fathers refused to visit their sick sons. Mothers abandoned their infants. Primal fear had replaced the Christian soul, and the social fabric was tearing apart. In the nearby city of Siena, the chronicler Agnolo di Tura witnessed a tragedy that defines the era. He recorded that the mortality was so vast that no one could weep for the dead, for everyone expected their own end. Di Tura himself was forced to bury his 5 children with his own hands in a shallow mass grave. There were no bells, no priests, and no dignity. He wrote, "This is the end of the world." The earth of Italy was becoming a patchwork of overflowing mass graves. Medieval doctors were completely powerless against this onslaught. Without the knowledge of germs, they believed the plague was caused by miasma, a corrupt vapor in the air triggered by planetary alignments. They instructed people to carry sweet-smelling flowers like roses and lavender to ward off the scent of death. They burned incense and stayed indoors, but the fleas remained in their clothing and bedding. Their best medical advice was useless against the reality of the rats. By the summer of 1348, the shadow crossed the Alps into France. The great port of Marseille was the first to fall, becoming a ghost town in weeks. From there, it moved up the Rhône River like a silent tide. In Avignon, the seat of the papacy, the mortality was so high that the Pope was forced to consecrate the entire Rhône River as a mass grave. Thousands of bodies were thrown into the water, as the ground was too hard and the living were too tired to dig any more pits. In June 1348, the plague reached the shores of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, England. The British Isles, protected by the sea, thought they were safe. They were wrong. The damp, cold climate of England proved to be a perfect breeding ground for the pneumonic version of the disease. It moved inland with terrifying speed, reaching London by November. The capital became a death trap. The narrow, filthy streets turned into corridors of rot, where the cry of "Bring out your dead" echoed. As the plague pushed into the rural heartlands, the world turned silent. In small hamlets across Europe, the harvest was left to rot in the sun. There was no one left to pick the wheat or tend the vines. Cattle and sheep wandered aimlessly through ghost towns, stepping over the unburied bodies of their masters. The bond of the family, the strongest force in medieval life, finally snapped. The social structure of centuries was dissolving into a primal struggle for one more day of life. As death tolls climbed into the millions, traditional Christian burials became a luxury of the past. In London and Paris, massive plague pits were dug, vast, gaping wounds in the earth. Bodies were layered like logs, separated only by thin sheets of lime to mask the unbearable stench. Chroniclers noted that the wealthy and the poor were thrown together, their social status erased by the black boils. For the medieval mind, this loss of a proper burial was a spiritual catastrophe. With the church powerless, a dark religious fervor gripped the survivors. Thousands joined the Flagellant movement, wandering from town to town in long hooded processions. They believed the plague was a divine punishment and sought to appease a vengeful god by whipping themselves with iron-tipped cords. Their blood stained the roads of Germany and the Low Countries. They sang haunting hymns of doom, their presence often bringing more panic and infection to the cities they entered. Fear quickly turned into a violent search for someone to blame. Rumors spread that the wells were being poisoned by marginalized groups. In 1349, despite the Pope's pleas for sanity, horrific massacres broke out across Europe. In Strasbourg, over 2,000 people were burned alive in a single day. The plague had not only infected the body, but also the human mind, fueling a wave of prejudice and violence that would leave a permanent scar on the history of the continent. The year 1349 marked the absolute peak of the disaster. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the sun-drenched plains of Spain, no one was safe. Kings and beggars died in the same week. The mortality rate in many cities reached 60%. It was during this time that the term the Black Death began to take root in the collective memory, though people of the time called it the Great Mortality. The world was witnessing a demographic collapse that had no parallel in history. The doctors of 1347 did not wear the iconic bird masks we see today. That terrifying suit was actually invented nearly 3 centuries later. During the Great Mortality, physicians wore simple, long robes, heavy hoods, and leather gloves, hoping to create a barrier against the disease. They were desperate men using ancient knowledge. They believed the plague was a miasma, a deadly stench. To survive, they clutched bouquets of flowers and herbs to their noses, trying to filter the air they breathed. By 1350, the machinery of the medieval state had ground to a halt. Courts were closed, taxes went uncollected, and schools were abandoned. With so many officials and lords dead, the rigid feudal system began to wobble. In the vacuum of power, chaos reigned. Bandits roamed the deserted roads, and the surviving peasants began to realize that their labor was now worth more than gold. The old world was dying, not just from the plague, but from the sudden absence of those who ran it. The plague even reached the isolated colonies of Greenland and the remote villages of Scandinavia. The Vikings, once the terrors of the sea, saw their settlements vanish. In Norway, it is estimated that nearly 2/3 of the population perished. Ships were found drifting at sea, their entire crews dead, acting as floating tombs. The great mortality had reached the edges of the known world, leaving behind a landscape of empty houses and silent churches under the cold northern sun. By 1351, the most violent fury of the pandemic began to wane in Western Europe. It moved toward Russia and the northern edges of the continent, but its power was fading. Humans were learning. The survivors were no longer just victims, they were becoming observers. They noticed that those who stayed away from the sick often lived. Slowly, the primitive terror was being replaced by a desperate, practical understanding of isolation. The shadow was still there, but it was no longer unchallenged. The city-state of Ragusa, and later Venice, pioneered a weapon we still use today: the quarantine. In 1377, based on lessons learned during the peak, they forced ships to wait for 30 days, a Trentino, before docking. This was soon extended to 40 days, or 40 giorni, giving us the word quarantine. They realized that time was the only filter for the invisible enemy. By separating the healthy from the dying, humanity finally found a way to break the cycle of infection. Historians generally mark 1353 as the end of the first and most devastating wave of the Black Death. After 6 years of relentless slaughter, the bacteria seemed to lose its momentum. The climate was changing, and the population density had dropped so low that the disease could no longer find enough hosts to sustain a pandemic. The plague didn't disappear. It would return for centuries, but the Great Mortality, the event that threatened to erase the human race, was finally over. The world that emerged in 1354 was a haunted, empty landscape. It is estimated that between 75 and 200 million people had perished across Eurasia. In Europe alone, nearly 60% of the population was gone. Entire family trees were extinguished. Villages that had stood for 1,000 years were now just piles of stones overgrown with weeds. But in this terrifying void, a new world was being born. The shortage of people meant that for those who lived, everything was about to change. With the labor force decimated, the surviving peasants became the most valuable resource in Europe. The feudal system, which relied on cheap, trapped labor, began to collapse. Lords were forced to offer higher wages and even freedom to attract workers to their lands. For the first time, a commoner could negotiate their worth. This massive shift in wealth and power created a new middle class, sowing the seeds of capitalism and ending the dark grip of medieval serfdom forever. The total failure of medieval medicine during the plague forced a radical rethink. The old reliance on miasma and planetary alignments began to crumble. Universities started to demand actual evidence and anatomical study. Hospitals, which were once just places for the dying to pray, began to focus on treatment and hygiene. The seeds of modern science were planted in the blood-stained soil of the 14th century, driven by the realization that ignorance was just as deadly as the disease. The psychological trauma of the Black Death gave birth to a new cultural intensity. If life was so fragile, it had to be celebrated. This led to a shift in art and philosophy, moving away from the purely divine and toward the human experience. This was the humanism that fueled the Renaissance. Every masterpiece by Da Vinci or Michelangelo is, in a way, a response to the plague, a declaration that humanity would still create beauty and seek knowledge even in the shadow of death. In 2022, scientists made a chilling discovery. The Black Death is still inside us. Analysis of DNA from victims showed that the plague caused a massive leap in human evolution. A specific gene, ERAP2, helped people survive the bacteria in 1347. Those with this gene lived to have children, passing it down to us. Today, this gene protects us from certain infections, but it also makes us more prone to autoimmune diseases. We are the biological descendants of those who survived the fire. Today, Yersinia pestis still exists in the wild, hidden in rodent populations from Madagascar to the United States. But we are no longer the helpless victims of 1347. We have antibiotics, global surveillance, and the hard-won lessons of our ancestors. The Black Death serves as a permanent warning. Our civilization is a fragile shield against the natural world. It reminds us that our greatest strength is not our technology, but our ability to adapt and survive when the lights go out. The story of the Black Death is not just a chronicle of death. It is the ultimate testament to human resilience. We lost millions, our institutions crumbled, and our world was turned upside down. But we did not vanish. We rebuilt our cities, reinvented our economy, and transformed our understanding of the universe. We are the survivors of the greatest catastrophe in history. Thank you for watching Dark History and Human Survival. Subscribe to witness the stories that define our journey.